I'm Trevor Griffiths. I was a doctor for 25 years and then set up the Emotional Logic Centre to help people to understand how their emotions can be turned to constructive use to prevent problems such as bipolar disorder from developing. I studied medicine at Oxford University and Westminster Hospital Medical School and was a pioneering family doctor with a research interest and developing new approaches to physical, mental and social well-being, and developed lifelong learning approaches as an alternative to counselling or medication for a range of common mental health problems and socially disruptive issues that can affect relationships and so on. And then my life built up to a time of crisis, a number of things happening all at the same time, and I experienced profound grief during which I was temporarily myself bipolar. I had mood swings. I recognized this happening in myself and managed to apply the emotional logic that I developed for other problems to my own situation and found myself coming through. And following this event, I started training emotional logic tutors, teaching them how to take this method out. And they've taken this around the world, which has been to great benefit of many people, families, organizations. We're working in the Middle East, in Russia, in Romania, in Zimbabwe, South Africa, and people in translation in all sorts of different cultures, whether it's an African tribe, or sort of the Arabic cultures and so on. Everybody can make use of this and understand it. So I know this is addressing core human dynamics of when there have been setbacks and disappointments. So this can be of some help to us here in this country where bipolar disorder is being increasingly diagnosed. Now, anybody's life can get into a state where there's a build-up of multiple disappointments that can become overwhelming. Even the strong have their limits. And we've focused in on the fact that people can grieve at the loss or even the risk of loss of anything that they value. Now, most people think of the word bereavement when we think of grieving, but in fact, if a friendship gets strained, if there's a risk of a loss of job, if something valued object or item for you gets lost, it sets off the same emotions as when there's a bereavement. And that whole process of emotional adjustment is called grief. So grief is not one emotion among others. It's a set of unpleasant emotions. And this set of emotions works together in an integrated way. That's what emotional logic is all about. The logic refers to the process of adjustment. There is a logical process, and you can make choices about where you want to be in it. That's the logical process of recognizing what's going on. But it's also an emotional process, as your emotions are preparing you inside for action or withdrawal in situations, withdrawal to reflect and plan, or action to get out there despite risk and make a difference. And that's what your emotional preparations are about. Now, emotional logic is saying that there are 7 core states that work together as a set, and these are inbuilt into us as part of our survival mechanisms. They're there to get us moving. And so emotional logic is largely about movement and stuckness, because sometimes when things accumulate and we get several small losses, all happening at the same time, you can be angry about one, guilty about another, shocked about another, depressed about another, all at the same time, and then we don't know what we feel, but life has just turned into a big mess. And those are the sorts of situations out of which conditions such as bipolar disorder start getting diagnosed by doctors or psychologists and counselors. And we're going to look here at a different approach to understand that in terms of grieving, in terms of grief emotions getting complicated as multiple disappointments build up. Now, I need to say, first of all, that bipolar disorder, and I'm calling it bipolar grief for very good reasons, as you'll come to see as we go on. But bipolar disorder is often getting mixed up now with something that used to be called manic depression. It's an unpopular term these days, and so people who had this diagnosis where they have profound swings from being very overactive and manic, suddenly swinging back to being very depressed and withdrawn, but these are extreme. And now people are commonly recognizing mood swings, and that's different, and I do think we need to distinguish these. Now, what was called manic depression, the severe, permanent, rare problem is actually a genetic weak spot in the chemistry of people's cells, in their cell membranes, so that it makes the chemistry of every cell in the body unstable. And this builds up into an inner sense of disturbance that affects behavior, thoughts and feelings. It's a true illness that can happen. Now, bipolar grief is something that can affect people of all ages, and it comes on, we're going to be suggesting to you, when there are multiple disappointments are affecting your emotions, so that you're getting swings of your emotional chemistry. So they both work through the chemistry of the body, but in one of them it is just that the extreme situation that you're in has pushed your chemistry to that extreme, so that it looks like an illness, but it's not an illness, it's an adjustment state. It's an adjustment problem. Now, of course, people with manic depression, with the true illness, they also grieve like any human being does. And so situational stresses can make the illness of manic depression worse, right? And that can make the families grieve more, and that feeds back into the whole sense of stuckness that can build up around people who have this illness. But when we talk about bipolar disorder, call it bipolar grief, here we can look at the language, the communication between people to help them express their emotions and understand each other differently. And that can bring a peace back into the situation that can calm the chemistry and allow those bipolar swings to settle down into normal types of grieving. I say this as somebody who has known that it is normal for people in extreme situations to get pushed to an extreme where the internal chemistry can begin to react like this, swinging from one side to another. But let's have a look at what grief is. It's about love, basically. Love in the sense of connection with somebody or something beyond yourself, right? So there's something creativity about the gathering together, and there's a joy on gathering together and building a sense of networking, or systems as we call it, people working together, a whole family or a community that ticks along. There's a joy in that. But disappointments, setbacks and hurts can suddenly bring you out of the joy type of love and into grief, where there's separation, where there's brokenness, where there's misunderstanding. These inbuilt set of 7 emotions and all the associated feelings come with them get activated for a reason. They have a purpose. They're not just there to spoil life. But many people have never made that connection, that all these unpleasant emotions are there as part of love. You only grieve if you have loved. And one way of avoiding all those grief emotions is not to love, is not to get connected. But that has its own sense of loss. We lose something in life by becoming rather isolated and so on. So grief is really the price that we pay for being in connection. So the shock, as there is disappointment or setback, can get turned into messy whirlpools of turbulent loss emotions. We're going to be looking at those because that's where bipolar disorder comes from. But the way out of this is through a couple of the stepping stones, as we call them, to adjust, called bargaining and acceptance. They're the growth points within grieving. They're where we explore how to reconnect with others, to move on from the situation that we're feeling so stuck and hurt within. And exploring how to reconnect restores the joy of love. So here we have the complete cycle, that the normal, natural state, the healthy state for a human being to be in, is in a state of connection, which means an infinite variety of ways for different people around the world, just what that means, cultural habits, you name it. But wherever that sense of connection gets disrupted, or people even see a risk that it might get disrupted, suddenly those grief emotions get activated. And emotional logic is helping you to understand that half of love, so that you can pick up these unpleasant emotions, say, hey, this is what's going on, see through them to the values that are being challenged, and then building an action plan on it through bargaining and acceptance. And that action plan is there to restore you into connection with other people, so you rediscover the joy of love. That's the cycle we're looking at. Emotional logic only really teaches about the bottom half, because once you're back exploring how to reconnect, well, the whole of life's open to you. It's freedom, and that's what this is all about, is rediscovering the freedom that we all can live in. Now, Emotional logic includes a way of mapping the hidden losses that are accumulating inside a situation. Here's an exercise that we do in some of our classes, our workshops and so on. We say when someone's had their car stolen, or it could be anything, it could be a push bike, it could be anything that is of value to you. But this particular example is of a car that was stolen. And we get people to list a number of different losses that they would see. And you can see that within one obvious loss, the car, people can often start to name a dozen, maybe more, different losses that are things that are of value, things that are important about that have also got challenged. Now each one of these will trip off its own loss reaction, and the emotions for each aspect can accumulate one on top of the other. So he's lost his saxophone, which was in the car, and he's lost his wife's respect because he really shouldn't have left it where it was. He's lost faith in the neighborhood because he thought it was safe, and so on. These are the things that can accumulate. Now this worksheet that loss reaction worksheet we call it, is mapping how the person will react to each one of these. And you can see here that this individual's style of grieving is that they get a lot of anger and a lot of guilt. And this particular pattern may see lots of ticks in two columns. This is what we call an emotional whirlpool. Someone's going round and round between these two and not making much use of the other stepping stones for adjustment that are available to them. This whirlpool will spin out a certain type of distress behavior, and this is the one that brings out obsessional behavior. An anger guilt whirlpool has built up so that this person will start to become obsessional. They go round and round with certain behaviors. They might become self-harming even. They might start binge eating. They might start getting extremely ordered. They might start going out and checking all the locks at night, just going round and round the same thing. We won't explain the background to that in this video, but we have spotted this time and time again in people. When we see this pattern, it comes out in some sort of obsessional behavior. But at exactly the same list of hidden losses, another person might map a different set of emotions onto those hidden losses. And this particular person would feel very shocked about a lot of them, but also depressed. Now we started to see this pattern when we started interviewing people with chronic fatigue syndrome, ME as it's sometimes called. We started seeing shock and depression time and time again. There's something about the chemistry inside your body of shock and of depression mixing together that really hinders the body's immune system and produces these fatigue states that can build up and so trap people. If you notice here also that there's very little anger here. Now anger in this model is not aggressive action. It's more like a passionate drive to engage with life despite danger, to prevent the loss of something that's important to you. So example, if you see a child running out into a street and a car coming, you will rush to prevent that child from moving any further. Even if that means knocking somebody aside, you will rush to do it. Now that person knocked aside might interpret you as being very aggressive, but actually it's that passionate drive to engage with life and prevent loss, that's the key bit, that has driven that. And that's what we mean here by the anger of loss. So we have something positive and constructive to say about every single one of these emotions, and that's the anger state here that we ask people to rethink the way they look at it. Here's a summary. I'm not going to spend long on this, but I encourage you to come back into this video and pause it at this point and read this in detail. But this is the summary of how we describe the adjustment process. The arrows on the top are the logic of emotional logic. Inside the situation change, can I recognize that I'm about to lose? Can I prevent it? If I can't prevent it, if it's gone, can I get it back? Can I recover the loss? And if I've tried and failed to recover it, I've got to look at what life will look like if I've got to let go of it, and so on. So it's a logical process. You can choose where you want to be in that, but it's also emotional, right? And those emotions sometimes are directed out into the world to change the world around you. Sometimes that preparation state is encouraging you to look inwards, to reflect on how I could change inside to adjust better to this whole situation. This is important as we teach people how to move their lives on in situations, getting onto that action plan. But if you look on the right, that bargaining, depression, acceptance, we have something constructed to say about every one of these, including the depression stepping stone. And that trio there, the bargaining, depression, acceptance, makes what we call a growth cycle. That's where people are exploring new ways of approaching difficult situations. So this process moves from shock, where we doubt our resources, to the growth cycle of bargaining and acceptance growth points with a bit of depression, where we're choosing between them. Yeah, and that's where we develop new resources. So we're moving from shock, where we doubt, to developing new resources. Now that same diagram could look like this, using the loss cards that we get people to lay out. We hand them cards and say, don't tell me how you feel, show me how you feel, lay these down and show me what's going on. And people lay them out in all sorts of different patterns. It's amazing the insights that people get into their own life, and if you get a couple doing this together, they see each other totally differently through handing these cards. I'd just like to say also that we've discovered through using these cards that men and women have equally rich emotional worlds. It's just that men tend not to name their emotions, they get on and act on them, whereas women are better at naming them and talking with each other about them. But both of them are actually handling these same concepts and same feelings inside. And so when you see this laid out, there's a process of adjustment going on here. And I'd just like to point out in the middle of this one that guilt card, I've talked about anger constructively, but guilty self-questioning does not mean that you're the cause of problems. It's the drive to learn more about life, about, is there something I could do differently? Can I take responsibility for something in this situation? And that sets you up then to get onto the bargaining stepping stone, where I'm exploring what I can do to get something back. So I just wanted to give you these bits of insight into the processes going on, which will help now as we move on to look at how does this get turned into a bipolar mood swing when situations have accumulated to multiple losses that are all complicating each other. So if somebody's laying out a card pattern and they're in a hypomanic phase of bipolar grieving in a situation, that's not, I say, it's not bereavement. This is where lots of different losses, setbacks, hurts have all happened at the same time, and somebody has lost insight really into how they're feeling. But when they lay out cards, they say, oh yes, I have got a bit of this, I have got a bit of that, and so on. They lay out patterns that are quite unique for them. And here's one that would show the sorts of things we might see during a phase when someone's very high and active and so on. It's the anger guilt whirlpool that's going on in the middle of there. Do you remember I showed you that one earlier? That's the one that can lead to compulsive behavior. Now on the right of this diagram, can you see that there is depression? And studies have shown that people with bipolar patterns of grieving have a background tendency to feel depressed. So that depression is off on the right. Right? And my guess, and what I'm going to share with you here for you to think about, is that people with this condition know that they're at risk of getting a depression. They know it. And on seeing a risk that they might, they start getting into a desire to prevent that feeling. So they're not trying to prevent another loss, they're trying to prevent that feeling. And so the anger and guilt compulsive whirlpool gets going as people start doing whatever they can to try and control their lives and do as much as they can to avoid that feeling of depression. So people start compulsively doing, spending money, buying this, starting up that, and so on, in order not to feel empty and powerless. But if you're in the depressive phase of bipolar grieving, this is a sort of pattern that you might get. Now here, the anger has dropped out of it. That drive to get out there and do something has dropped out of it, which is actually a constructive thing, but has now been set on one side. In its place has come shock. And what I'm suggesting here is that somebody who is hypomanically doing whatever they can to prevent it suddenly might get to a point where they doubt their resources to keep going and prevent the feeling of guilt. So suddenly shock appears on the scene. And if the shock then ties up with that background depression, we've got a shock depression whirlpool, which means this person could suddenly feel fatigued. The energy might just switch off, and they just suddenly feel they've got to go to bed. That's the way the body's immune system chemically is talking to the brain. When these two emotions get together, they're affecting the body's immune system as well. The immune system tells the brain, hey, you're ill, stop what you're doing, go to bed, let me have the energy down here to sort out what's going on. But in this situation, it isn't that there's been an injury or an illness going on, it is that life has just become so stressed that that shock is just going wham on the chemistry and pushing it off to an extreme. So this sudden feeling, profound feeling of fatigue suddenly comes on, and the person who's been hypomanically out there doing everything they possibly can suddenly just collapses. Now that means that it's not a classic depression as people would normally mean when they talk about a clinical depression. It is a fatigue state. It's a particular state of grieving, which is actually normal grieving pushed to a limit. Any one of us could get into any one of these whirlpools when pushed to a limit, but certain people have certain tendencies and preferences to go down certain routes, certain habits of grieving, as we talk about. But this is the bipolar pattern, where the habit of grieving is to say, I do not want to become depressed, therefore I'm going to do whatever I can, and I'll compulsively go at this and go at this until suddenly I doubt what I'm doing. Suddenly the shock comes. I doubt my resources to keep this up, right? And then the shock tangles up with the depression. I'm in the shock depression whirlpool. My chemistry goes wham on the brain, switch off, go to bed, right? And here you're in what looks like a clinical depression, but actually it's all grief. The whole lot is normal grieving pushed to a limit. And if people could just start to respect the grieving self as a loving person, you only grieve if you've loved. That makes you more of a human being, not less. If you understood your grief differently, you'd be able to choose a different route to go down. If other persons understand grief in the same way, the two of you can talk together about the whole thing as it's building up. And that changes everything. Emotional logic ultimately is a conversational skill. It's a life skill. It's to help us adjust to disappointments and setbacks early by connecting with people so that we can make adjustments in harmony with other people rather than getting pushed into our own inner emotional and mental world, telling ourselves we've got a mental illness or we've got a weak or bad character or we're dangerous characters. Rubbish. This is human nature. This is our humanity. Join the human race. That's what it's like. But let's learn together. That's what that guilt stepping stone is about. The guilty feelings don't mean that you're the cause of problems. It doesn't mean there's something wrong with you. Those guilty feelings are the way that drive is put into you to question, to learn, to explore, and get on to your growth cycle. Having done a bit of reflection, we have something constructive to say about every one of these unpleasant emotions. So how do I get out of it? The learning point in this particular pattern of bipolar disorder, bipolar grief disorder, is that neither of those patterns have acceptance in the pattern. What does acceptance mean? Well, we might need to talk about this more. Maybe if you could speak with a tutor, you could apply it to your own life more precisely. But in general terms, we speak of acceptance not as accepting that something's gone and therefore I'm diminished. Acceptance is we've come to accept that we have limits over one particular hidden loss. We do it one at a time. You don't accept whole situations. It's not about your whole character. It's not about life in general, but about one value that you've named that's at risk of loss. Can I accept that I'm limited to manage this one, to get this back or to keep it? And what does life look like without it? Now, in true acceptance, we say it releases all that energy of grieving to explore something totally new in life. So in true acceptance, there can be a sadness that something has gone, something valued has gone, but that releases energy to make use of opportunities. If you can't make use of opportunities, then probably you're actually on the depression stepping stone, where you're still trying to decide what you should do about these individual named losses. We say it's the place of decision. It's actually where you grow in wisdom, which is it wiser to do for each particular loss. So this is the way that we talk about grieving constructively. The depression stepping stone doesn't mean that you're empty and powerless. It feels like that, but it means, hey, you ought to name some hidden losses and you've got some decisions to make about them. And generally speaking, the bargaining and the acceptance moves people onto building relationships as a way forward when change has pushed you out of a comfort zone. So the idea is I'd like to encourage you to look at learning emotional logic with someone you trust. We have free videos online through through a website called learnemotionallogic.org. There's no www in front of it. learnemotionallogic.org. Totally free, just no registration, just have a look at those. Do that with someone so that you can talk together about it. All right. Emotional logic will equip both of you to talk constructively about your unpleasant emotions without hurting the other one. So that's where it goes. A list of hidden losses, a list of your values. You only name something as a loss if it's something you value. And in fact, recognizing these unpleasant emotions is actually information to us about our values. So talking about losses, talking about unpleasant emotions is not morbid. It's not a sign of weakness. It's not just ruminating on something useless. It's getting into the stuff that makes us a human being, the value systems that we have. And emotional logic is all about making an action plan with someone you trust. So it's turning those emotions into the energy to move on in life and explore something despite it feeling a bit risky. So unpleasant emotions are not a sign of weakness, right? They're important information for you. And that's what I'd like to encourage you then to do. Explore emotional logic so that you can rethink your emotional world. You can rethink your relationships. As you understand the grieving you look at the other person, you think, hey, maybe you're also grieving as well. We've got something different to talk about now. We're not going to just talk about situations that we're stuck in or bad decisions. We're going to talk about, actually, we're both grieving here. What are you grieving for? What are your values that have been hurt? What are mine? Can we team up and I'll help you get yours back and you help me get mine back? That's emotional logic.